Hello and welcome to the Futurist Letters show. My name is Cairo Smith. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Futurist Letters. I am also the host of the Futurist Letters podcast. If you want to sponsor the podcast, this is where your sponsor message will go. So please consider supporting the show. We have a cool Dutch auction where the price goes down toward the end of the month for the next month of sponsorships. So you can check that out. It's all automated on our website. And then we will say whatever you want us to say. This episode, I am joined by my co-host, Kenny White. Hey, Kenny.
Hey, how's it going, Cairo?
It's going pretty good, man. And we have the pleasure of talking to Amol Kapoor, the machine learning researcher, the Civ player, a man of many interests. And I'm sure this is going to be a very delightful conversation. So you can watch this with video on Substack or on YouTube. You can also listen to it on Substack. You can listen to it on Spotify. You can add it to your Apple Podcasts all through the Futurist Letters website, futuristletters.com. And on futuristletters.com, we will also have a special after show episode where Kenny and I will be chatting about how it went with Amol, any other thoughts, anything that might have been on our minds during the episode. So if you want a little bit of candid reflection from us, please consider becoming a paying subscriber for just a few bucks a month. That will get you access to both the journal and the podcast behind the scenes, because we also have a written behind the scenes segment for the journal. But the journal itself is free, as is the show, and we are very glad to have you here. And of course, Amol, we are glad to have you here as well. So please.
Hey, Cairo. Hey, Kenny. No, it's great meeting you guys. And thank you so much for having me on the show.
Of course, it's our pleasure. So for people who might not know, tell us a little about what you do and what you're interested in.
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Amol. I've been in the AI ML space for about 10 years now, which if you've been paying attention recently has gotten very hot. So I started doing AI ML actually when I was an undergrad at Columbia. I was doing a lot of connectomics research. Connectomics is the study of the human brain and like putting neural circuitry, like biological circuitry on silicon. And so I was attempting to use deep learning techniques to try and understand the Drosophila retina. The Drosophila is like a fruit fly, very, very popular model organism. So I'd been interested in ML and AI and deep learning specifically for a long time. I joined Google Research for about 4 years. While I was there, I was doing all sorts of stuff, computer vision, a lot of 3D, like turning 2D to 3D. Then I switched over to graph learning and representation learning, and a little bit of robotics. You've almost definitely interacted with something my work has touched, which is kind of cool, although most of that would have been kind of in the back. And then in 2021, I left to start my first company. There's a company called Soot. We were doing consumer vector databases for artists and designers and creatives. So you can check that out at soot.com. And then in August, I actually recently left to start a second company, a company called Tilework. And we're still kind of working out exactly what that's going to be. But, happy to chat about that more if that's kind of interesting. But it's very exciting stuff, I think. And then other than that, I more recently, actually, since I left my first company, I've started writing. So you can find me at 12 grams of carbon on Substack. But the writing has kind of just been more for me than anything else. It's been a lot of fun, but Kenny seems to have found my work, which I think was really great. And so he invited me on, which I'm very excited to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, first of all, I love your blog. This is one of the few moments, at least few moments in my life where the recommendation algorithm actually gave me something useful and novel that I probably wouldn't have found any other way. So thank you, Substack gods, if you're listening. I have a bunch of questions. My background is not in machine learning or artificial intelligence, but I have, you could say like an amateur's interest in it. My background is more on the economics and cryptocurrency, decentralized finance side, which gives me enough of a background to feel like I can convince myself that I might understand some of the things machine learning researchers are saying. And part of why I personally was really excited to have you on. This is a great excuse for me to ask all the questions that I've been wanting to ask someone who really knew. And now that you're a captive audience, you have no choice but to at least give an answer.
It's funny because actually I would say the same thing about crypto. Like I've been a passive, like I feel like I have enough of a passing knowledge, but not enough to actually know what I'm talking about. So sort of a funny thing.
Well, maybe depending on how much time we have as things progress, we can flip the script.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
ask me some questions. And Cairo and I used to work together at a crypto startup that I founded, and so between the two of us, we can probably give you, if not a complete answer, at least an answer.
Enough of an answer. Yeah.
I'm learning nothing ever really ends. In that sense, I've had a few moments like that today, but it's good. I think there's a sweetness to that. Yeah, please, Kenny. I want you to lead this one. We'll hear what you have to say and what Amol has to say.
Okay, so the first thing that's on my mind is last night I got in an argument with my younger brother, who's also into crypto, and we were talking about like self-driving cars. And
Sure.
he was like, hey, like Tesla is totally ahead, like they're totally crushing it. And I was a little bit more pessimistic. I was like, I don't know, man. Like, I'm not so sure that they are. I feel like Waymo's the one to beat. I know you've expressed opinions about this.
Yeah.
And I was hoping you could break it down for us a little bit and go into some, maybe starting like with who you think is ahead and why.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I did write about this on my blog kind of recently on the back of Tesla's earning announcements and some of the stuff that they were doing in Austin. So I guess as like background, one of the nice things about being at Google when I was it was like kind of an interesting time where ML and AI had really taken over Google's infrastructure and was like really important within Google, but had not really like blown up on the scene externally. And so a lot of stuff that was happening internally was like really exciting to AI researchers. And being a part of the AI research team, one of the AI research teams, I was able to kind of get a lot of early access to stuff. One of the things that I got early access to was I was able to drive in a self-driving car in 2016. Whoa. So back then it was actually not even called Waymo, it was called Chauffeur. It was still a Google X project. And I had a chance to talk to some of the Google X folks on what they were doing and like how long they had been working on this and stuff like that. And people don't really realize this. Waymo's been around since 2008. Like it's been around for a long time. People have been working on this for a really, really long time. So anyway, it's kind of interesting background. I am a pretty big Google believer here and Waymo believer. Like I just think that Waymo is really far ahead of the game and also has kind of like really nailed it. And I think there's like a lot of really interesting technical reasons for why that's true. And we can talk about like the pros and cons of the different sort of the technical nature of this. But there's also sort of you can call it like a vibes based thing here where it's like, I think Waymo just has, often this actually hurts Google. Waymo has a culture of safety. They really care about making sure that their cars are really safe. And this hurts Google when it's like, competing against a startup. We've seen how, Gemini maybe really got hurt in the early days of the ChatGPT Gemini kind of, head-to-head thing. Google's like over indexing on safety actually kind of really hurt it in getting market share. But I think the opposite is true in Waymo, where it's a car and like, you have a person in there and you have people outside. And so, there's a whole raft of people who care a lot about safety, not least of which is the person who's buying the car, but also like regulators and the public opinion and things like this.
So is that to sort of say if Google has the same feature out as another competitor, since Google has such a high safety standard, you can assume they've maybe ironed out more kinks than a similar company with the same feature if they're actually putting it to market?
It depends on what you mean by iron out kinks, right? Like sometimes too much like safety kind of features can also be a problem. You saw this with Gemini where like they purposely were over engineering their prompt in order to like encourage diversity.
Oh, you
and
have
that
like
would like
Black
result in
George
sort of like
Washington.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
So funny.
So you have like these weird situations where actually that can backfire. You're only as good as the creativity of the people who are in your lab. But when it comes to Waymo, I can say with some amount of personal feeling that I would be willing to bet money that like any amount of testing that's going into a Waymo car has been done more than like the equivalent testing that's been done on a Tesla.
Right.
And so I tend to be very bullish on Waymo. This has also, I think, been borne out in their sort of dominance in the robotaxi space. There's basically only 2 players. There used to be more, right? There was Cruise and Neuro and Aurora and Zoox and all these other companies, and a lot of them have kind of either fizzled, been acquired, or been told to get off the roads. And Waymo has not had any of those problems. They've been quite successful.
So what is it about the Waymo tech? The way I look at it, there's like self-driving cars is both like a very extremely difficult engineering problem, but also there's a component of business strategy to it.
Yeah.
It's not just about solving the engineering problem, it's also about like scaling the problem in order for the business economics to work out. From an engineering standpoint, what do you think Waymo is doing right? And also from a business strategy standpoint? Let
me like take a stab at the second one first.
Okay.
Sure.
And I will say, like, I'm an ML researcher, so I don't know. You're the econ guy, right? Maybe you. I always had the sense that, like, if you could get self-driving cars to work, it didn't really matter how hard it was to get it to work. As long as it could work, you were basically sitting on a money hose. Because like software is really cheap. It has zero marginal cost, or functionally zero marginal cost. The cars are potentially expensive, but manufacturing costs keep going down. So there was always this sense that I had, and I think a lot of people in the self-driving world had, that if you managed to nail this extremely hard engineering problem, the business thing would more or less solve itself. And I love Google's like research culture. I love a lot of I spent a lot of time at Google. I think they're great. They're not like the best at the business thing. They start a lot of projects and then those projects fizzle. But with Waymo, I think that it's kind of borne out that, like, yeah, it turns out if you just have self-driving cars, it is just a strictly better experience than Uber or Lyft. Are you guys based in San Francisco, or have you been to San Francisco and tried a Waymo ever?
I lived there before Waymo really became mainstream, so I left during the pandemic. But I've heard a lot of, basically everyone I've talked to who uses it, like I think my cousin still lives there.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, I kind of only ride Waymos now. It's like my first choice.
It's a magical experience, and I really recommend.
This is what I've heard.
Going.
I'm very curious about this. Everybody says it's like sort of otherworldly.
That's a good way. There's something about just watching the steering wheel move itself, and you pull out of like whatever parking spot you're in. It just kind of all happens seamlessly. Yeah. Waymos are about, last I was in San Francisco, Waymos were, which was like maybe 6-7 months ago. Waymos are about twice the price to 3 times the price of an Uber or a Lyft. And they take longer. They take about like 10 to 15 minutes longer. That's a little bit exact. Maybe like 5 to 10 minutes longer.
To show up, or the time it takes to drive?
Both.
Okay.
They're safer, so they go slower.
Right.
So it takes you longer to get to where you're going, and it's more expensive, but people still really like them because they're just really cool. So I think that, like, on the business side, my hunch was always like, if you could solve this really hard engineering problem, that the business side would more or less work itself out. We can talk a little bit about, like, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff that happens on the, like, insurance and regulation side of this. Waymo does not exist in New York, and that's like a regulatory thing. And so, like, part of the business is actually, how do you manage the regulatory risk? I think this is why, like, Waymo has like an extremely intense focus on safety, because they know that, like, the counterexample is Cruise, right? Cruise got into one really bad accident where they ran over a pedestrian.
So someone crossing the road, right, at night, they were jaywalking.
Yeah. And what ended up happening, actually, that was like really bad for them, was the car stopped on top of the pedestrian.
I see.
And so, like, for like a while, like for like maybe like an hour, this pedestrian was just like stuck under the car. Now, doctors have actually said after the fact that, like, it was a good thing that the car didn't keep moving, because that would actually cause more damage.
I've heard this, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the optics of having a person stuck under a Cruise branded vehicle were really bad. And so they got kicked off the streets, right? Like, that was it. Right. Like, Cruise basically got shut down.
It's so interesting how, we lose about 100 people a day in auto accidents. Yeah. And yet it doesn't seem like that's the bar to beat for self-driving in the public psychology. It's like the bar to beat is 0,
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. And this is actually, like, I think a big difference between Tesla and Waymo. I think Tesla is sort of the opinion that, like, if they can beat the average human driver, they can get robo-taxis. And my personal hunch is like, no, that's not true. Like, the court of public opinion is pretty brutal. Anytime a Tesla gets into any accident, all of Tesla's brand is kind of like,
Yeah.
and the same is true as Waymo. It's funny that you mentioned this though, because like, so we're talking about this like long tail of incidents. Most cars, even in 2016, right, when I was driving, when I got a ride in the chauffeur, I felt in 2016 that the car did a fantastic job. The real problem is this like super long tail of incidents, and this is actually where the business side comes into play on the engineering side. The reason it's actually tough to start a business here is because it's the long tail that you really have to worry about, and that's what makes the engineering part of this so difficult. Is like, how do you deal with the sheer amount of variety that can happen on a road? There's kind of this like soft assumption that part of the reason there hasn't really been any self-driving cars north of San Francisco is because they don't really know how to deal with snow yet, and they haven't like practiced on snow. And so like there's a whole range of long tail events that can happen in snow that like these cars have just never really experienced. And like, how do you deal with it? On the technical side, there's I think a lot of things that Waymo is actually doing better than Tesla specifically. You mentioned this briefly, but like about the technical differences. I think the main difference is just Waymo has decided that their cars are going to be like 90% sensors. It's like almost more sensors than cars, car. And Tesla, for a reason that at one point I think was kind of reasonable and now I think is like less reasonable, basically said like, no, we're only going to use cameras.
Yeah, for me as a layman, when I think of Waymo versus Tesla, I think, obviously like a Waymo uses LiDAR and a Tesla is only cameras. Maybe I'm like vastly overestimating the knowledge of like your average person, but to me that's like the shorthand difference.
I think that's about right. If you're a little bit more technical than that, you might also say like Tesla has more road hours, which is true, and Waymo has more time, which is also true. But like more time actually spent working on this problem,
like years of development.
Yeah. But I think that's like as a rough approximation. Waymo actually has, I think, if I remember right, actually has even a few more sensors. I think they also, I could be wrong about this, but I think they also have like a radar on there. Like they have all sorts of like weird sensors on there, besides just like the cameras and the LiDAR. Right. That's like a huge.
Sorry,
go ahead.
It's just funny that these cars are so sensor heavy. Considering, for me, for a little bit of background, I also worked on a Google spinoff project for many years. I worked on Niantic. I worked for Niantic Labs, which did Ingress and Pokemon Go, and I was there in Venice when it was still a Google project. And I remember, we should do a full episode on this, but most of my bosses were all ex-CIA, which I think is public. I think I can say that publicly. And someone said to me one time over drinks, like, a lot of people are very happy that we're making this game because it's a great way to get people all over the world to go point their phone at any random spot that you want at a moment's notice. So I wonder if the same thing is true, if about Waymos, pointing their sensors wherever.
I will say, like, this is maybe a slightly different kind of culture, but like Google's internal culture has always been pretty sensitive about working with DoD and with intelligence agencies in general. I suspect if that was true, if there was like a relationship there, somebody would have leaked that already. I suspect.
That makes sense.
But yeah, I will say when I was at Google, we definitely used the Google Maps LiDAR data for all sorts of neat projects, and none of those were like particularly sensitive. But like as an example, I mentioned I was doing 2D to 3D reconstruction. We used a lot of the Google Maps LiDAR data for that. So that data doesn't just Google does store it and uses it for interesting things, and it doesn't just show up in Google Maps. Yeah.
Does it feel cool when you get a ton of data and you set it up and then you start doing ML on just like a massive computer bank with a ton of flops? Are you like, wow, I have so much power in my hands?
There was definitely, I think the first time I ran an ML job at Google, I was like, wait, I just spun up like 1,000 GPUs. Like, that's crazy. And they didn't even ask me any questions, I've actually anecdotally heard that resources are a little bit more scarce these days because Gemini is like sucking up all of the resources. And so if you're just like a average, not Gemini researcher, it's actually a little bit hard to get your allocation. But when I was there, like it was super easy. I could just ask for whatever, and I would just get like tons of GPUs, which was very cool. Yeah, that was amazing. Like that was incredible. Going from rinky-dink college, my laptop GPU to like Google's super clusters was pretty sick.
So speaking of machine learning research, you recently wrote an interesting blog about how deep learning was very similar to applied topology.
Yeah.
And I feel like that made a lot of intuitive sense to me. So I was wondering if you could kind of break that down and explain what exactly you meant by that in a way that maybe someone who has never heard of topology before
sure
could kind of follow along with.
That's actually probably a good thing that somebody who's never heard of topology before, because I got raked over the coals by some folks on Hacker News for misusing the term topology. But so a lot of people have different ways of thinking about what deep learning is doing. One of the things that's really interesting about deep learning, I think it's interesting, is that we don't have a formal language for this yet. So you can look at physics, right? You can say if I drop a ball of a certain mass of a certain height, I can predict a lot of things about how it's going to behave. That is not true of neural networks. We don't really know what these things are doing. And if you work with neural networks a lot, you end up kind of developing a mental model for how they work. And different researchers have different kinds of mental models. The one that I like to use is thinking about things in terms of geometric shapes, and more specifically, like positions on a coordinate plane, or positions in like a 3D space or something like that. So taking a big step back, right? The way a deep learning model works, or the way a neural network works, is you give it a set of data, and this data can be anything, and you turn it into a vector. A vector is basically just a list of numbers. It's a fancy way of saying, like, literally list of numbers is, I guess, the more layman's way of framing it. You turn any input into a list of numbers, and then the model takes that in and outputs a list of numbers. And the output is then mapped back to some sort of, something that makes sense to a person. So a good example is, like, let's say I had an image classifier. I wanted to train a model. This is the famous, like, hot dog, no hot dog thing, right, from Silicon Valley. Let's say I wanted to train a model to tell me whether or not there is a photo, like a hot dog is in this photo. I could take a bunch of images, and funny enough, images are already representable as a list of numbers, because each image is essentially a height times width times 3 matrix. So you basically take that whole thing, you convert it into a list of numbers, and you pass it into a model. And then the model spits out a single value. And that single value is just a number. But you tell the model, okay, if you spit out a 1, I'm going to interpret that as, like, yes, there's a hot dog in this photo. And if you spit out a 0, I'm going to interpret that as no, there's no hot dog in this photo. And so you have this data set of images, and basically whether or not there's a hot dog in that image. And as you pass the model through multiple steps, each time it'll go, yes, I think this is a hot dog. No, I think this isn't a hot dog, based on that 0 and 1. Based on that 0 and 1 output. Feel free to stop me, by the way, if any point, like...
No, this is good. And to be clear, in the training data, you've already tagged which ones have hot dogs, right?
In this example, you would already...
So it can get an idea of what a hot dog is and what the absence of a hot dog is.
Right. So just as take a particular example, like say I had a photo that did have a hot dog in it. And let's say the model outputs a number between 0 and 1, right? It's not going to... It very rarely will output exactly 0, exactly 1. So let's say it outputs like 0.3, right? So you can interpret that as the model saying, I am 30% confident that there is a hot dog in this photo.
Right.
But we want the model to be 100% confident that there's a hot dog in this photo, because we know there's a hot dog in the photo. So we actually say, excuse me, Mr. Model, right? You should be 100% confident. You are actually off by 70%. And so then you can do a little bit of complicated math. It's actually not that complicated if you've done any calculus, but like you can take some partial differential equations and blah, blah, blah. We can smooth over that. But through a process called backpropagation, you can actually take that 70% delta and adjust all of the weights in the model so that the next time it sees that same photo, it's more likely to say, yes, this is 100% a hot dog. And if you do that over a huge corpus of images, eventually the model will have in its internal weights some sort of a representation of, is there a hot dog in this photo? So getting back to the topology of this whole thing, right? I said that you convert things into a list of numbers and it outputs a list of numbers. And actually the entire model is just lists of numbers. Like that's all it is, right? If you were to take a slice of this model, just like a small, single part of it, you would basically have a list of numbers that somehow represents the input image. So if I pass in an input image that has a hot dog in it, it'll be one list of numbers. And if I pass it in an input image that doesn't have a hot dog in it, it'll have a different list of numbers. And this is where it gets like a little bit sort of abstract. That list of numbers is also like a coordinate. You could point that on a plane or on a 3D surface or an n-dimensional surface or whatever. Mm-hmm. So if your intermediate state was actually only 3 values, let's say you only had like an x, y, and a z, you could actually literally point these all out on a volume that you could then render for a human to look at. And you'd be able to see every single image that you pass in turned into this 3-dimensional vector, this point in 3-dimensional space.
Right.
When the model is first initialized or first created, that 3-dimensional space is going to look like total garbage. It's just going to have points everywhere. There's not going to be any semantic reasoning. But over time, as you train the model, you would expect to see a split. You'd expect to see clusters form where certain images that have hot dogs in them will be in one part of the space, and other images that don't have hot dogs in them will be in a different part of the space. And so you can actually then like draw a line through this representation, through this 3-dimensional representation, or in this case, like draw a plane between this 3-dimensional representation.
Right.
And now you have a classifier. Everything on the left side of this line is a hot dog, and everything on the right side of this line is not a hot dog. Right.
And I assume, well, I guess first I want to ask the most basic question, which might also be the biggest one. Is this how we work?
So kind of, this is a funny question and a very difficult one to answer. Extremely difficult. Maybe is the short answer. Like, okay. Like I said, I did a bunch of work in connectomics, and there are definitely some things in our brains that kind of look like this if you squint, right? So a good example of this is like a good friend of mine actually is doing a PhD on like mouse olfaction, like smelling, like how do mice smell. And if you look at the structure of a mouse nose, it actually looks a little bit like a neural network. You have this like bottom layer of neurons that basically just bind to proteins that come from different substances, like there's like a protein for chocolate, and then there's like a protein for like lime or whatever, and like those proteins will come and bind to these molecules or bind to these neurons, and then there's like a layer above those neurons that are all connected to all of the like kind of lower level neurons, and the signals from the nose get sent up into this upper layer, and somehow that upper layer then does some sort of signal processing, and then that actually gets sent up to another like higher layer. And then eventually this gets like really deeply entangled in the brain, and you kind of lose sight of like exactly how this thing is modeled. But at least for those first 2 layers, it looks kind of like you have a representation of smell. One of the things I've said on my blog, and this is I think one of the most interesting parts of neural networks and kind of this whole area, is if you think about it, you can turn anything into a list of numbers. So it wouldn't be surprising if like the brain is somehow taking these input signals, whether it's like heat or light or touch or whatever, and converting it into a list of numbers, which is then represented as electrical signals. But there's other ways in which this is like not quite correct, right? The neurons in our brain are much more continuous. They don't like have like on-off switches the way that like sometimes neural networks will behave. And there's also something to be said about like frequency, like the frequency at which neurons will fire has some sort of like important signal coding properties that we don't really know yet. So the answer is like fuzzy yes, right? I think that like there's something about this like compressed representation where you can represent anything as a list of numbers that like does probably map to something about what the brain is doing, but the actual form factors probably looks very different.
That makes sense. So when you take like this artificial neural network, this deep learning approach, and you train it on text data and have it be able to predict, like you give it like a string of text, like the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy, and then say, what's the next token? And then it's able to be like, well, we run it through all these things. We we take that whole sentence, we put in this vector space, and we see, well, like that sentence is really close to the statement, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy, is really close to the statement, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog.
Yeah.
So we're like, okay, well, the next token we're going to guess is dog.
Yeah.
I think that's like a good way of reasoning about it. I will say that like modern transformers don't generally represent sentences. They generally represent individual words. So this is kind of this is very fuzzy, and so I apologize because like the whole field is kind of fuzzy. But like you can, if you squint and you look at a transformer, you have what's called a bunch of representations for these words. Every single word, and actually it's not even words.
Now, is it words or is it tokens?
It's tokens. It's tokens. Every single token in the vocabulary. What's up?
What's the difference between a token and a word?
Great question. Okay, so there's sort of like a technical definition, and then there's sort of like a layman's definition. So I'll start with the layman's one. Like a word can be composed of a bunch of smaller subsections, right? We know like ing is like an important ending that means something. We know that like, you know, anti, like anti is like a word, is like a prefix that means something. So in the same way, you can imagine that like words themselves, like there's a lot of different words. There's like so many words in the dictionary. Words may not be the most compressed way to represent concepts, right? You might be able to, it might be better for a model to learn a prefix or a suffix than it is for it to learn an entire word. So a similar logic kind of applies for tokens, except less human readable or like less human reasonable. There's like a set of 50,000 tokens or so that 50,000 might be actually small now, but like this is at least what like the original versions of ChatGPT were trained on. And the way they figured out what these tokens should be is they took a large corpus of text and they just said, compress this as much as possible, given a space of 50,000 tokens.
That makes sense.
So you get certain things that are like obvious tokens, like THE, right? Like it just appears so many times that it makes sense to represent that as a single token. But then you get some like really interesting things. So for example, like Barack Obama
is in the top 50,000.
Well, okay, so I think actually Barack Obama is without the B.
Without the B.
Yes.
Wow, which obviously is not a useful token if you are translating Chaucer.
No,
So it's
right.
maybe the English general model is not the most efficient for like a use case.
Right.
In a specific domain.
The reason it dropped the B is because there are other places where sometimes you want like a lowercase b and sometimes you want an uppercase b. And so it like picked up Barack Obama as like a common enough token.
I don't think you would ever want a lowercase b for Barack Obama in formal writing. So it must have been like Twitter brain rot that it was reading or something.
It's actually like there's enough other places where you need a lowercase b versus an uppercase b that the model that produced this vocabulary was like, it doesn't make sense for us to represent this additional character when we already have a character token for the uppercase b.
Wow. Okay.
So it's like really like you can kind of squint at it and it kind of makes sense, but then also it like kind of doesn't. It's like very alien.
And the reason this is good is because they're like, if you almost think of the tokens as characters, it's like, sure, it takes more space to store all the characters, but then it's a more efficient way to store all the text.
Yes,
if you have all these characters. Well, this kind of points to Chinese being a more efficient compression algorithm than Roman characters, I guess.
I could talk a lot about compression.
Okay, sorry, I'm just making things up.
No. It's actually like okay. So this is a very much a tangent, right? But like one of the more interesting threads, if you ever read like any of Ilya Sutskever's work, for example, this is something that he pushes a lot. Ilya Sutskever was like chief scientist at OpenAI and was responsible for a lot of really, really important research from like 2012 to today. He is like obsessed with compression. He thinks a lot about compression. I'm going to throw around some technical terms. He thinks a lot about like Kolmogorov complexity, if you've ever heard of that term. Thinks a lot about like entropy. And the reason that these are really relevant is because there's sort of this idea that, which is a theory, it's not really necessarily obvious, but there's this idea that like intelligence is essentially a form of compression. So the people who kind of very firmly believe this would say something like, a sufficiently complicated compression algorithm is indistinguishable from intelligence. I don't know if I personally believe this, but there are definitely a lot of reasons that like suggest this might be true for neural networks. We find often that like neural networks that have more compressed representations are often able to generalize to more tasks, which is sort of an interesting and maybe potentially counterintuitive thing that actually ends up occurring.
So in a very literal sense, if you had a person survey an area and become very familiar with it, and then you took him somewhere else and you had him recreate this area, you could almost argue metaphysically that he has compressed the information of the area he's familiar with in his brain, which is smaller than, say, Disneyland. And he's compressed Disneyland into his brain.
That's exactly right. That's exactly correct.
Got it.
And this is like super weird if you think about it for too long, right? Like it's sort of like a strange concept because, you know, when you look at like something like ChatGPT, so, you know, Kenny, you asked this question like, well, it's predicting like the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Like, it's weird how much you can get out of just compressing the internet, right? Why does it know that the next word is dog? Why does it know that like I can ask it like a math question and it'll like probably get it right? That's sort of weird, right? In the very early days of, this was before ChatGPT came out, when GPT, I think it was just GPT-3, people were like, you can play chess with GPT-3 because if you feed it chess notation, it will spit out chess notation. And that's really weird. Like, the model wasn't trained to understand chess. It doesn't even really understand like coordinates, like 2D grids or like the rules of chess or anything like this. But somehow you can give it chess in and it'll give you chess out. And that's like really, really weird and interesting. So unclear, right? There's definitely like a sort of metaphysical, philosophical bent to all of this.
I think I got introduced to OpenAI. I know exactly when it was. It was in the summer of 22. This is when all this stuff was on my radar. And I was playing at that time with the ChatGPT, I think it was GPT-3, the GPT-3 playground. Sure. And I immediately knew, oh, this is going to change the world. This is going to change everything. But I actually think, in a way, getting introduced to the technology in that format helps you understand what an LLM is a lot better than the way most people get introduced to it today. Which is to say, in that original form, you just had one document, and you could write text, and then it would essentially autocomplete. And it would fill in, and you would fill in. And there wasn't this idea of it as sort of a conversational partner. There was no chat. It was just GPT as essentially an autocomplete, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't get the opportunity to internalize how much of an autocomplete it is. When their first experience is like, say, something like the voice mode, of GPT-4o. I don't know. Yeah.
There's something very uncanny about this. And there's actually like a picture that I think like really encompasses this. It's like, I don't know it off the top of my head, but like if you look up like GPT Cthulhu meme or something, you'll probably find it. It's like a picture of like this like writhing mass of tentacles. And then like, they call that like unsupervised training. And then there's like a little like human-like figure that is like made out of these tentacles. That's like, they call that like RLHF. And then there's like a little smiley face. And like, that's like the ChatGPT that you actually interact with.
I think there's an account called AI Not Kill Everyoneism Memes that created this image. This is like related to like Yud and all these like Stop AI people, safetyists as it were.
Yeah.
And they've been using, I actually wrote something a couple months ago that someone specifically asked me to use cosmic horror as an LLM analogy, and I said, okay, I can do that. Yeah.
There's something very alien about it. It's kind of interesting. And I do think that you're right that if you play with the the sort of like pre-trained only models, the ones that have not gone through rigorous post-training and instruction tuning and human feedback and whatever, you really do get a sense of how alien it is.
Yeah. For me, somewhat as a power user, I don't like how it asks the user, were you pleased with this interaction? Thumbs up, thumbs down. I think there was this big issue, the sycophancy issue with 4.0 becoming too agreeable. I don't trust the users of ChatGPT to make the model better through their human feedback. I wish that OpenAI would stop asking because they make the model worse.
I feel like
I don't know, maybe that's snobbish.
I feel like part of the problem too is, I mean, it seems to me like certainly less so with Gemini and Google, but maybe it definitely feels the way with OpenAI and ChatGPT, where they're like, our goal is to make this model as good and useful for people as we can, and the way we measure it is by how much time they spend on the model, and that creates that kind of which I think is very similar to what like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all these like doom scrolling apps that we know and love so much today had a similar objective function where like, look, we want to make this app as great as possible for people, and the way we're going to measure it is how much time they spend scrolling. And that leads to perverse incentives of like dopamine hacking, and I think that's where a lot of the sycophancy came from, because they probably realized like, oh well, when our chatbot says really nice things to people and says like, wow, that's a great fucking idea, you should totally do
it. Asks follow-up questions incessantly. Like if this, you're actually creating, if you want data so you can go back to your job and you have a model that's constantly asking follow-up questions, you're actually creating like an anti-productivity tool in a sense, because it's taking the user away from their task for longer, right? I don't know.
I will say, like, my hunch is that the sycophancy actually didn't come from the user feedback.
Really?
It's possible. My hunch is that it actually came from, and this is, I think, where it often comes from being a little bit too... So like just like taking a step back, right? Like one of the things I think a little bit about is like alignment research. Like what does it mean to align an AI model? And this is like a really hard thing to answer.
What is it for people who don't know? What does this mean?
Yeah. So you have this thing, this oracle in a box, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's fundamentally alien. It doesn't have any biological hardware, right? It is literally a stack of linear algebra, but somehow it is able to do things that approximate thinking and reasoning and stuff like that. How do you teach this thing to have human values, right? Like you don't have to teach a person that like hurting other people is bad generally. Like there's some weird people out there, but like generally speaking, most people kind of intuit that hurting other people is bad. But an LLM has no concept of this. And more generally, like let's say you want to teach, you try and teach people that like racism is bad and sexism is bad, and like, teaching people how to build bombs is bad. Like all of these things are bad. How do you build a tool that like accurately reflects the extremely high dimensional complexity of human values? So this area of research is called alignment. And it's a really, really difficult area of research, in part because we don't have a fixed set of values, right? You ask like two different people what they think is good or bad, and they'll give you completely different answers, and it's totally contextual. So anyway, oftentimes what I think is what happens when you see these like really big swings in the behavior of a model, something becomes too sycophantic, or this was actually something that happened with Grok, right? Like Grok kind of
the Mecha
really
Hitler
off the
incident.
rails. Yeah. I often think that the Mecha Hitler incident is actually like a slightly different thing, but often what I think is happening is somebody is trying to make a change that they think is going to be a small change that will improve the model's alignment, whatever that means. And it's weird to say that in the case of Grok, but in some sense that's also true there. Like the team at XAI wanted to align the model to be more edgy, essentially.
Sure, which is
right?
that's their values, right?
That's their values.
Yeah.
And so these subtle changes in like the prompt, or like, the sort of like high level like instructions to the model cause it to go way off the rails. And like I said, we don't really know how ML models work. So we don't have a good sense a priori of what changes are going to result in the model becoming too sycophantic or too much like Mecha Hitler, right? Like we just don't really know.
Do you think for people who are against the development of AI, do you think that the fact that we don't really know how they work is a strong piece of evidence for them to use in their argument that we should not be building it?
So I will say, like, I am also more often than not an AI doomer.
An AI doomer, meaning you think it will cause bad outcomes for you?
I think it'll cause bad outcomes, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe not like immediately, but like I am definitely concerned about like how little we understand this piece of technology and how much it is. There was a very influential Wait But Why article from like 10 years ago or something. It was a long time ago. Tim Urban and he basically describes like what AGI might look like. And one of the things he talks about is if you get to the point where you have an AGI that can recursively
artificial general intelligence.
Artificial general intelligence, yes. Which, by the way, is like a very fuzzy term. There's kind of a funny joke that like AGI is whatever a computer can't do.
Yeah, I sort of believe that. I subscribe to that. I think the goalposts will be moved for a long time on AGI. Yeah.
I'm kind of a believer that we already have AGI for any reasonable definition of artificial general intelligence. But
yeah,
that aside, I think that there's like something. Okay, so Tim Urban talks about what happens if these models are able to start recursively self-improving. Which, by the way, is kind of a big holy grail in the AI space. Everybody is trying to figure out how to make these models recursively self-improve. This is like a big area of research. One of the concerns that Tim Urban kind of lays out, and I think is a realistic concern, is that if you have a model that is able to recursively self-improve, it will get much better very quickly, like extremely quickly. Maybe not even on the course of like months, but potentially in the course of like days. This is in the Bay Area called like FOOM, FOOM, like a FOOM scenario. And the concern is like, if this was to happen, which, you know, there's no guarantee that it will happen or won't happen. But if this was to happen, we wouldn't be able to control the model once it has reached that point, because it will have become so much more, the concern is intelligent, like so much more intelligent than any individual human. This seems a little bit like sci-fi, and I think it is like sci-fi a little bit. But it also doesn't strike me as like completely unreasonable. So when I am like thinking about alignment research and stuff, I'm definitely on the side of, hey, it would probably be better if we had better controls on how these things actually worked before we, you know, decided to put it in charge of our missiles.
But obviously, we can't, there's no world government sufficient to stop everyone from building these things, right? So I guess there's sort of, this leads to the counter argument of, well, all that we do when we slow AI research is slow our lead and hand these tools to our rivals. You know, how do you feel about this line of argumentation?
I did a little bit of college debate. I did a little bit of high school debate, a little bit of college debate. And there was a form of argument that was widely looked down upon. It was called China baiting. So basically like the structure of the argument was like, we have to do thing that is broadly unethical or potentially unethical because otherwise somebody else will do that unethical thing first. And like, I think this is like, I think there's like times where you have to like kind of spend some time actually deconstructing why this is maybe not a great argument. My own personal perspective is like, I don't think this is a great argument because frankly, we are actually quite far ahead of like other people who are trying to make AI models. And it's not clear to me that like we shouldn't encourage people even in other countries to have these sorts of limitations. Like we have nuclear non-proliferation treaties, for example. And those are like arguably effective, like somewhat effective. You know, its effectiveness is debated, I guess, but like that seems better than just allowing nuclear weapons to be developed en masse wherever. Of course, somewhat unfortunately, like this is all going to sound very silly unless something actually bad happens. And so, you know, like I think that like it's very, very difficult to encourage people not to maybe push forward very blindly. For what it's worth, I also see the other side of this. Like one of my sort of more controversial opinions is that like I think the FDA should be way more willing to approve drugs. Because
I was just going off about this like on Twitter somewhat recently. There's a drug that I want to use that's going to take until 2029 to come back. It's a nerve regenerative drug. And I was saying, you know, just give me a form that says I don't care. You know, I know the risks and I don't care. I'm an adult. Just let me sign it. Come on, guys.
Nobody measures the opportunity cost of...
You know? Like new drugs is a completely different form of risk than like new AI. Like a new drug, okay, like the only people it's really going to harm are the people that use it, which is going to be a relatively small subset of people. Whereas like you know, an AGI doomer scenario, that's like, well, you could potentially wipe out all of human species, which I don't think is realistic but it's, probability greater than 1. And so it's a very different level of, or different, just sort of philosophically a different type of risk management.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it says something that like many of the people who spend a lot of time thinking about AI models also are like tend to like raise flags about this. Some of this can be a little bit self-serving. Like it probably is good for Sam Altman to be like, we are building God in the machine, everybody. Like everybody be careful, give us a lot of money. But yeah, it's a sales pitch. But I also do know like, I think like Ilya Sutskever, for example, really does believe this. And so, and I think a lot of other people in AI really do believe this. And I definitely have my, I think it's probably unrealistic that like, it's going to cause a mass like extinction event or something like that. But I do see it potentially being quite harmful in like even more subtle ways. I think in the short term, for example, you could expect to see a pretty significant increase in all of the negative effects that come from like being addicted to Instagram.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I was playing around with Grok Video today, and I was just thinking, oh man, this is a hole you can just fall into, just sort out your brain.
Sometimes I feel like, there's like biological viruses that like are sort of spreading their genes against our will, using us as vectors. And there's like mind viruses, like memes that are like spreading, propagating against their will, using our brains as vectors. And I feel like we haven't built up the immunity. You need an immune system to fight off these viruses. A lot of times when you have like why did Eurasia like conquer like the North, South America, and Australia? It's because of the antibodies, basically.
Huge part of it.
I feel like we don't have the antibodies as a species to really fight off potentially the mind viruses that these LLMs are capable of producing. Like the ability to like manipulate people so subtly is kind of off the charts. And I think we're not even really at the, we're not even I'm not super bullish on true artificial super intelligence coming along anytime soon, but you don't even need to get there to dramatically
have negative effects.
The manipulative capabilities of these models.
One of the there's two thoughts I have. One is like there's a very famous thought experiment, which is like the super intelligence in a box. Like imagine you had a super intelligence trapped in a box. Could the super intelligence convince somebody to let it out of the box? And I think like the answer, as we've kind of explored how not just AI, but even more like kind of generic algorithmic approaches to personalization have worked, I think the answer is kind of like, yeah, probably. It seems like the engagement, you mentioned, this is the second thing is like you mentioned everybody's so focused on optimizing for engagement. You can only really optimize for things that you can measure. And it seems like engagement is like plausibly like correlated with having a good platform. But then also you can see like, oh, wait, there's like tons of negative side effects that could happen from this. Yeah. So, people talk about like paperclip maximizers where like, oh, a rogue AI like decides to turn the entire universe into paperclips or whatever.
Because they've been given a goal like make paperclips and they take it to a literal extreme, right?
Right. And you have that literal example playing out at tech companies where it's like you're given the goal of improve engagement, or actually in a more like, to be more prosaic about it, make the shareholder value go up. And then you pursue that with such relentless focus that you actually end up causing a lot of harm.
I think you can argue, I've seen good arguments that corporations share organizational similarity, right, to organisms or artificial intelligences, right? Like that a group of thousands of people that has been optimized to increase engagement is functioning in some way as a paperclip optimizer, in that sense.
There's a story that I gave a presentation on AI safety actually last year to a couple of VCs. And in that presentation, I kind of made this analogy. At the height of the USSR, there was, the Central Planning Bureau that was like responsible for setting targets for economic targets. And they basically set an economic target for whale blubber. That this is like kind of a weird example, but like they set an economic target for whale blubber, and it was like a really high target. and nobody was using whale blubber. Like nobody was using like the oil. Nobody was using it for meat. But the target was set, and so you had all of these fishing captains basically going out and killing whales, and then the whales would just like thousands and thousands of whales, and then the whales would just sit in the docks and nothing would happen. And I don't think that the Central Planning Bureau was like, ha ha ha, today we are going to kill thousands of whales. Like that wasn't the point, and yet that was the outcome. Like that was what happened. And so it's sort of sobering to think about, like, you have these corporations that are composed of people, and you can talk to a person, you can reason with the person, you can empathize with the person and sympathize with the person and build a mental model of a person in a way that you cannot do with an AI. And yet we still are unable to kind of like fully rein in corporations in some sense, and we are unable to rein in like the USSR in some sense. And so yeah, that's like a little sobering sometimes, and it's one of those things that kind of leans me more towards the like, hey, maybe we should be cautious about creating something that, you know, we want to treat as super intelligence.
I have to assume that Congress does not believe, at least most of Congress does not believe Sam Altman is building God, because I would assume that if a politician believed that God was being built, they would try to nationalize it. It just seems implausible to me that you would allow this random corporation to build God.
Separation of church and state, Cairo.
Yeah, I guess. Okay, yes. God can belong to the free market.
There was a, I don't want to call this a rumor because it's not like really a rumor. It's like probably like more factual than rumor. But like the rough story about like why a lot of Silicon Valley shifted to the right was, the story that I've heard is that the Biden administration was pretty explicitly like, we are going to regulate AI. Like we're going to come in and we're going to regulate AI. And there was already a lot of, like, the Biden administration was also very vocal about like crypto and regulating crypto. And really,
they were antitrust, and Warren especially getting a position in the administration. Her whole life mission was to break up big tech, pretty much. So yeah.
And so the story that I've heard is that like once it was very clear that the Biden administration was, to use terminology that I don't fully agree with, but I think this is how it was phrased, was going to like pick winners and losers. Basically pick the people who were allowed to like work with the government, and then everybody else was like not going to be allowed to work on it. That led to a pretty hard shift right among people who cared a lot about this stuff and like were the investor class in this space. I don't know how true that is, so take that with a grain of salt, but like that's at least one story that I heard about like why Silicon Valley is kind of in its political state right now.
Well, that's definitely what happened with cryptocurrency, which is what I'm more familiar with, where, you can think of blockchains and tokens and smart contracts, the underlying technology, as being somewhat value neutral. It's something you can use, and like any technology, you can use it for great things. You can also use it for not so great things. And when Biden was president, his administration went out of their way to make it very difficult to do anything. What you want out of regulation is just like a clear framework, and hopefully as an entrepreneur you want it to be like a permissive framework, but you're happy to have a clear framework that's like strict, as long as it's clear what's right and wrong. They were like, everything's wrong, but we're not going to
we're not going to tell you
what.
And the enforcement was very rare and very arbitrary. And very opaque, right? Like Coinbase. Coinbase was being threatened with SEC regulation, and they kept asking, what can we do to become compliant? What can we do to become compliant? Just tell us what to do. Right? And they were not getting an answer.
I have a couple of friends who worked in the crypto space who run a crypto startup, and they've kind of described a situation where like the SEC wasn't just going after their companies, but also was going after them personally, like the CEOs of these companies personally.
Oh yeah, and debanking them. This has actually been quite common still. This is actually still happening under the Trump DOJ, is the secret debanking of crypto execs.
Oh, interesting. That's interesting. I mean, I am not a fan of the Trump DOJ for a lot of reasons. So add that to the list, I guess. I think that like I heard about I also like Matt Levine has talked about like how the SEC would enforce rules, and enforce is like kind of a weird word. It was literally like, you just have to kind of like read the tea leaves and then hope you don't get fined. And if you do get fined, I guess that's the rule.
Yeah.
which definitely strikes me as unfair. But also, I am not not at all a person in the space, and I think even I think Matt Levine has written about there's some ways in which this is kind of nice. Like if you're like a big institutional bank, for example, it's actually kind of nice because this basically kills all your competitors, and like you can pay the fines.
Yeah.
Which maybe has pros and cons for the wider market. I don't know. But it definitely, first glance, feels unfair.
And those were some of the only tea leaves people were reading. I remember there was a huge Ethereum spike in, I think, 21 or 22 because I think BlackRock or someone like that announced an Ethereum ETF.
Yes.
And people were so starved for information from the government that when this was announced, they went, oh, this is a bull sign because, of course, BlackRock knows something that we don't. So if they're doing an Ethereum ETF, that must mean we're not completely on the list to get canned, right?
Yeah.
It's not a healthy market when it's that information starved. Yeah.
To kind of dovetailing into innovation policy, because I know you've written a decent amount about that as well. Is what's best for Silicon Valley also what's best for innovation? And maybe more specifically, is what's best for big tech also what's best for innovation? Or are Silicon Valley / and or big tech somewhat misaligned with innovation more broadly, do you think?
So I think so this is there's sort of a Wittgenstein sort of thing here, right? It depends on your definitions, right? Like all problems are problems with semantics. I would say that ideally, in an ideal world, it would be great if the incentives of Silicon Valley were also aligned with the incentives of the country more broadly. And you can even extend that further, right? The incentives of the world more broadly, right? And I do tend to think that because it's big tech companies and Silicon Valley in general have so much influence in the world, not just in terms of usage, but also world politics and information. And, we're living in a more globalized world than ever. I would love it if that was the case. I think that as we've kind of already discussed, there are some places where that doesn't seem to happen, right? So we talked about engagement and engagement hacking. Pretty negative. Seems like a pretty negative thing. Seems like most people don't really like that. I don't like how much time I spend on my phone. And yet we still do this. So sort of in a trivial sense, it is clear that there is some amount of misalignment, right? I think there's a larger sense, which is what is the purpose of big tech and when does it no longer serve its use? I think that one of the things that was true for a long time was big tech had a pretty sterling reputation because maybe I'm just speaking for myself here. I just remember being on the internet in those early days. There was a sense that these larger tech companies were idealistic in positive ways. Google's do no evil, right? Or don't be evil. And they just kept giving away things for free that were obviously useful and really good. Google, for example, ran a DNS server basically for free, and they've become the backbone of the internet in a lot of places for free. And
Google, Gmail, Google Drive, all these things.
All these things.
People were used to paying for Office and Dropbox before these Google products. Yeah.
So I think there was a sense in which these engines of innovation are really, really positive. And as long as they're really positive, it doesn't really matter if they're really big. That seems great. It's harder to say now. We just live in such a more polarized world. I pretty strongly disagree with, the folks in the Valley who still support this administration, for example. I know that there are Silicon Valley people kind of up and down this administration, and it's really hard to look at what's happening with they just fired their consumer labor board person. What are we doing? What are we doing? If
Speaking
you really
of Soviet,
yeah, right.
Yeah, production targets will be adjusted until
until morale improves. If you really have a commitment towards free inquiry and research and progress and technological and techno optimism and all these things, I kind of think it's probably hard to look at some of what are the things that Silicon Valley is doing right now and to feel really good about that. I want to also caveat Silicon Valley is a big place, right? There's a lot of people there. So I want to say parts of Silicon Valley, the vast majority, I think, of people who work there are very excited, are basically excited nerds like I am, right? They
Yeah.
love it. They love being able to work on cool stuff and solve hard problems and make the world a better place. And I think that is still the motivation for most people. But yeah, I don't know. I think that there's like some amount of it feels like there's been a divergence between.
Very, very bluntly, I want to ask, when you look at the polling, there has been this huge schism between men and women in America over politics. It used to be by race, white versus non-white was a huge split. And it almost seems like as race has become less predictive, sex has become more predictive.
Sure.
So is this just a guy thing in Silicon Valley being Trumpy? Like, are the women going there, or are the women still sort of on the left camp?
I would actually think, okay, so like my feeling being in the Bay and whatever is that like the rank and file engineers and like the people who, are actually building stuff, and especially the people who work at like the Googles and the Metas of the world, like these people are very lefty. Or like it's sort of like the traditional sense, right? Like they tend not to like, maybe not thinking about politics too much, but like when they do think about politics, they are broadly liberal, right?
Like left liberal or
like pro LGBT, like pro trans rights, and like pro global, like if they've thought about like the economic policies, like pro that separation of church and state, all these things. I think that like where you tend to see more of a shift is more targeted in the entrepreneurship spaces, the places that have become markedly, I don't want to say like right wing, but like more right wing. Are places that are much more entrepreneurial, places who are kind of like in the sphere of the like, the big VCs and the incubators and the Elon Musk world and stuff like that. I guess Elon's kind of his own thing. So, but yeah, like I'd say like the rank and file engineer who works at like a Google or a Facebook is like actually still pretty left liberal. You just have like a very vocal contingent of people who are kind of responsible for making for doing the entrepreneurship side of things that have become more right-wing, I think, over time.
The job creators.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, a lot of those, I think there's like, I think a lot of those people were originally very libertarian. Like I fell in that camp for a long time as being like, very libertarian, kind of eyeing with skepticism bureaucracy and like, government intervention and like college. I've written in the past about like my experiences in the university, for example, and like the pros and cons that I felt there. I definitely was not somebody who was like, everybody needs to go to college. Like, I felt strongly that was not the case.
Yeah.
So I think there was like kind of this contingent of people who were like more libertarian, maybe who like, I think the term was like the intellectual dark web, like kind of like in this space, whatever, heterodox, whatever. It is hard to see how many of those people have kind of fallen more into the more explicit populist.
Yeah, I would say that the transition has been from intellectual dark web or libertarian or whatever you call it to what they would call neo-reactionary right, which is a more authoritarian bent of this. And I encounter these people a lot online. I think I know exactly what they think. And what they think is almost like, I just wanted to be left alone to do my thing. And now
I have to be political.
Now I realize that I must destroy my enemies with unrelenting authoritarian prejudice. And then I can go back
to just building in quiet,
doing whatever I want and building in peace after I destroy all these people. Yeah.
So something I've been thinking about a lot, which is related to the policy side of things, but maybe actually more technocratic. I think that like we've talked a little bit about like these optimization engines for engagement and whatever. Increasingly, I am just of the opinion that like the term I use is like epistemology, like the study of how you know things in philosophy. Like people's epistemologies are everything. Like where you get your sources of information is everything. And so what I think happened is like a lot of the people who are kind of more on the heterodox side of things got this steady stream of information about how everything was terrible because of the progressive left. And for what it's worth, it's a big country and it's a big world.
I mean, I got that, and it was called just like going to college and seeing these people.
Well, okay, so it's funny, right? Like I went to a very progressive university, and there were definitely moments where I was like, wow, this kind of like very far left bent is very annoying. But also, I was like, it never really impacted me. Like, at no point was I ever like actually meaningfully. I think there was like one weekend where I woke up earlier than I would have because somebody was protesting on the lawn or something. But like, other than that, like even in this like location that's supposedly this hotbed of, you know, activism, I never personally felt any really meaningful impact. But I think it was possible, and it's still possible, to like generate stories, like thousands of examples where people did something that felt unfair or unreasonable. And so, have you ever heard of this thing called the Chinese robber fallacy?
No, please explain.
Okay, so this is like the basic structure of the argument is like, there are so many people who live in China that even if you found 1,000,000 examples of Chinese people who were robbers.
Okay, this is exactly where I thought you were going. Okay.
Yeah. Even if you found 1,000,000 examples of this, you would have no point whatsoever. And I think one of the things that's really dangerous about our current hyper-optimized engagement, whatever algorithms, is that you have these streams of thousands and thousands of examples that actually don't signify anything. They don't signify anything at all. But our monkey brains are like not good at figuring that out.
Yep.
I don't know if that's necessarily like a engagement farming problem. I think that goes back like centuries. Like remember reading a Civil War history book, and leading up to the Civil War and antebellum U.S. on both sides, there would be all these pamphlets about how horrible like freed slaves were and how you can't let them.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, like how horrible like the Northerners were, or how horrible like, the Southern slave owners were. And I mean, I especially when I was in San Francisco, I had a lot of liberal friends.
Yeah.
But I also, part of my family are ranchers. And I can just imagine, like, their probably image of what like a rancher would be versus what I experience when I'm hanging out with my family, with that side of my family. I'm like, these are pretty good people. Like, I think that's we just want to see that, we just want to like, I feel like part of the problem with these feeds is like, it's just giving us what we want too much. Yeah. Like we want to have an enemy. We want our biases confirmed with cherry-picked anecdotes. Like,
I mean, if being angry gets you engaged and getting affirmed gets you engaged, then like the natural like whatever local minimum of this, like as far as like what you're going to be served is things that affirm and outrage you. Yeah. Right? Like that's the most potent combination.
The reason I mentioned the feeds is because like let's say I wrote like an article that I thought was like really, really compelling on a certain topic, whatever, like a certain political topic. The only people who would see it would be people who already agreed with it. And people who disagreed with it would only ever see the worst possible version of the counter argument. Because that's just how the engagement feeds are set up. Right. So you can't escape that. Like it's very, very difficult to escape the sort of like hyper optimized, we are going to serve you exactly the worst possible thing that will get you deeper into the rabbit hole.
Yeah. I do think, on the Chinese robber subject, and I'm going to be pulling that out now. So you gave me a new tool in my rhetorical arsenal. It's like, if something happens thousands of times a day and you are hearing about one instance of it as newsworthy, you have to ask why.
Yeah.
What, say it's a death, say it's a traffic accident, say it's, it could be just because a celebrity was involved, right? Yeah. But like you have to ask like what is elevating this rhetorically above the noise? Yeah. Kenny, when is a good time for me to ask a big philosophical question about ML?
I think now's a great
time. Okay, I guess I sort of coerced you into that with the way I framed it.
I did want to add before we get to
please go ahead, Amol.
Said yes to any time.
Before we get to the Kenny, you asked me like about my like opinions about policy. I think that the biggest policy improvement that we could have in the country, this is like a very technocratic solution, but I think it's a good one, is like we should just make it so that all algorithmic optimization is opt-in instead of opt-out. Like you can just do that at the federal level, right? The federal government can say, hey, we think that all forms of optimization, personalization or whatever need to be default opt-in.
That's actually why I use Twitter and I don't use almost any other social media. Because I open it and I go to my following tab and I see a linear, uncurated list by chronological post date of all the things from the people I follow.
Yeah.
And it is less addictive than the For You feed, but it's kind of like taking your coffee with less sugar. Some point as a grown up, you just do that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And sure, those people are still seeing For You. So I'm still getting second order algorithmic toxicity. But you know what? Even if I quit the internet, I would still get that because people would still be coming up to me and telling me things they read algorithmically, right? So you can't fully escape it. But I at least I do appreciate for all the chaos. It's like there's like Elon Musk is like so high temperature with his decisions that like you end up with some that are like so far out of the norm that they're like in a place that aligns with you, just in the randomness of it.
I kind of think that like one of the benefits of like kind of doing this at the federal level is that it would hopefully tone down the temperature across the board. Because like there's sort of an arms race, right? Like Meta's done a lot of research on like what happens if you turn off the engagement stuff, and they just lose users. So they have no incentive to do that. But if you did that across the board, then everybody could.
It's a detente because it's like a prisoner's dilemma, and like
it's literally a prisoner's dilemma.
I do think you get situations where there's regulation on something, and the corporations go, "Oh, thank God, we don't have to do that anymore."
Yes,
because our competitors are being banned from it too.
Yeah.
Well, that's what happened with like tobacco regulations, where like you can't advertise on TV anymore, and the tobacco companies, I mean, they're the companies they're hiring to do the TV ads were very upset, but the tobacco companies themselves were not that. I mean, they weren't that upset because like, well, this is like a huge line item in our budget that we can just take out.
Yeah.
It's funny because like I actually think that like if my ideal like technocracy ever comes through and like all of this stuff becomes default opt-in instead of like you have to like opt out or whatever. I would love it if like next to the button that lets you opt in, there's like a big warning sign, like cigarette style, that's like, this will rot your brain. Like, do not turn this on unless you really know what you're doing. And like some number of people will still do it, but like, I do think those sorts of interventions work, and like it would probably help a lot with the way that like discourse kind of works in this country right now. So,
okay, here's the question.
So you had a big philosophical question, yes.
Yes, here's the question. So you work on ML. You work on simulating organic intelligence in ML. Have you almost had an existential crisis over there being no material or metaphysical difference between an organism and inanimate matter? Such as a stack of linear algebra.
No, I personally know. But also, I personally haven't had that crisis because I was thinking along these lines like 15 years ago. Okay. Like part of the reason I got into this is because, so originally a long time ago, like when I was in high school, I was very into molecular biology. And one of the things that's like really interesting if you get really into molecular biology is you realize that like everything that is about us is just proteins, like to a first approximation, right? If somebody can't see, for example, if somebody's blind, like in theory, with enough proteins, you could fix that. Like you just need to create the seeing
in the
proteins,
right place,
right? In the right place. And this is obviously like a very rough, I'm like kind of smoothing over a lot of things, but like that was kind of a big thing for me, was that realization. And part of the reason I got into connectomics was the sort of realization or the feeling that like if you were able to perfectly map somebody's brain and then put it on a computer, you would have something that was indistinguishable from a person.
How do we codify the ethics and the legality of this as a society?
We can't do it yet, so there's that.
Okay.
I don't know. You asked originally about like ChatGPT, right? And like and LLMs and ML and whatever. There was a news story that was maybe like 4 years ago now, where a guy at Google who was working on a very early version of an LLM, actually Google had an internal LLM that they didn't release before ChatGPT, which I think a lot of people don't know. It was called Lambda, and Google did not release it at the time because they were concerned that it was, again, the safety.
Yeah,
thing,
it's
right?
so fun. I remember Adobe had voice gen, like perfect voice gen, maybe 7 to 10 years ago. And they basically demoed it at a conference and said, we're not releasing this.
Yeah, they sat on it.
Yeah.
There was an AI researcher, I can't remember his name now, but he basically was like, I think that this AI that we've built, Lambda, is conscious, and like we
Oh,
need
he
to.
crashed out majorly
Yeah.
over this. Yeah,
He
I
did. He
read
did. He
about
did.
this.
Um,
Uh-huh.
and at the time, everybody was like, "This guy's kind of insane." But as these models have gotten better, it's weird, right? Like it's kind of weird. Like
Yeah.
I don't think that I don't think that like the average person could easily tell the difference. And already we see this huge rise of people who are younger who are like getting really emotionally attached to these AIs, right? They're like their
Yeah.
character AI type things. Oh, I have my AI boyfriend, my AI girlfriend, my AI BFF. So have I ever personally had an existential concern about this myself? Not existential. I kind of already believed that like, humans are basically really good pattern matchers or really good at compression or whatever.
You
And that, like,
you accept your existence as a
yeah.
material being.
But I think that like an important part of this story is like
Uh-huh.
one of the things that makes humans really unique is that we can choose our own values. Like I have 2 dogs and I love them and they're amazing. But like there's also a sense in which like they are operating at a lower level of like being able to choose what's important to them. They eat and they sleep and they kind of relax, but they don't really have like higher level goals. They have personalities. They very clearly have personalities, but they you couldn't like my dogs don't have something that's like valuable to them beyond like more base emotions.
I don't know. Some of these twin studies on life outcomes make me really wonder how much we just think we're choosing as we're being run
Yes,
by
there is
our pre-made software. Yeah.
There's a very interesting so one of the more interesting things in physics, which is like kind of weird, is that when you move at the speed of light, time compresses, right?
Yeah.
And the reason this is really weird is because it says strange things about our universe. So let's say like a photon gets emitted from a galaxy like a billion light years away from us, and then it gets absorbed by my eye, right? From the perspective of the photon, that is instantaneous, which means that somehow my eye, me, the universe, whatever, existed at the time that photon was emitted a billion years ago. Somehow.
Right.
I don't know what that means. Like, I have no idea what that means. But there's sort of this like interesting, like, as you sort of poke at the edges of different fields, whether it's AI or physics or whatever, some of our assumptions about how people work and how like fundamental concepts work starts to break down, right? And I definitely
I was at the beach the other day. I was just lying there listening to the ocean, and I this thought crossed me. Time is really just a dimension like space, meaning all of this just is. Nothing is actually changing. I don't know if this was true. I sound like I was high as a kite. I promise I was sober.
Very like Dr.
Something
Manhattan
that washed across me. But yeah.
If you've ever read Watchmen, like this is like a very Dr. Manhattan thing. Like he exists in all periods of time at once, and so like it's constantly like able to see all of them.
Are you guys familiar with like the concept? I think it's called like a box universe, or I think a box universe.
No, what's this?
Not off the top of my head.
So there's like the Newtonian concept of time, which is probably how we experience the world, which is there's a now, and my now is the same as your now. Cairo is the same as your now. Amol.
Yeah.
You're just kind of how all these nows coming, and you kind of like lay them out in a sequence.
Yep.
But when you apply like relativity, like the Einsteinian concept of time, the now actually, what my perception of now depends on like the speed and direction that I'm moving.
Sure.
And if I'm going like at relativistic speeds, or even just like depending if I'm like on like a bicycle and I'm biking one direction versus another direction, billions of light years away, the definition of now can change by like hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Just depending on like what direction I'm going in any given time. And so the kind of like philosophical conclusion from this is that there's no like idea of now. It's all just everything has already happened. There's just like it's like you said, Kyra, it's just another dimension. And now
very Buddhist.
You can go back and forth about how accurate this is, and some people agree with it, some people disagree with it. But that's the concept of a box universe. Like everything that's ever happened is like in this box, and depending on where you are in the box, you can navigate around. And like the concept of now is completely different from what you think it is.
Yeah, this is like a very like Buddhist conception of like, there's only the present, right? And like even like a second ago is just a memory now, right? Like it's literally just something that lives in our collective my head. And so like there only really is like a meaning to focus on like what is happening in the exact moment or something like this. On the AI side of things, like I think that regardless of, I'm sure a lot of people will have sort of these like more existential things, and you kind of see people pushing back on this. Like I think part of the reason why the definition for AGI has shifted so much is because there is a certain amount of identity that is wrapped up in this idea of like, people are the only people who can reason.
Yeah. I have a pet theory that one of the reasons we killed all the other hominids is because it gave us an existential crisis to see a spectrum of life from Animalia up to ourselves, right? Yeah. And so we literally, physically, like through slaughter, created enough of a missing trough. Distance, yeah. Yes, a trough between ourselves and the animal kingdom, right? And then I feel like AGI might fill that right back up. I don't know.
It's one of the things that I think is more really interesting. Like among other things, I like to read religious texts. Just mostly for like cultural reasons. I think it's like fascinating. The Catholic Church is really against AI. The Pope has like talked about AI and has talked about like how this is like a really dangerous thing that like potentially will, I forget the exact wording, but like degrade the sanctity of human life.
Interesting.
Which is like a
now, are you
fascinating
talking about the current Pope or Francis
Pope.
recently deceased? Current Pope. Okay, current Pope. Yeah.
And part of the thesis is like the theory is that like part of the reason he was elected, besides as like a counterweight to some of the stuff that's happening in the U.S. political sphere, is also because he has strong opinions about this particular thing, and like this is also becoming a very important thing for humanity.
He actually chose the name Leo because the last Leo, as you probably know, presided over the Industrial Revolution, right? And he said we're at a similar crisis. Yeah,
right.
I feel like the Catholic Church has like two options when it comes to AI. One is to be like, these don't have souls, therefore we have to keep them at bay.
Yeah.
There's something there. The other direction is these do have souls, therefore we have to make them Catholic.
There's
I'd probably go with option B.
We have to make them Catholic. That's good.
Yeah, Catholic AI.
It just seems like the best way to grow your market share. But
there's this interesting. So like brief tangent on like the soul thing, right? Like consciousness is obviously, as an AI researcher, something that's very interesting to me. And like there's kind of this loaded question. I say loaded because nobody has a good definition for this. There's a loaded question of like, are AIs conscious? And the answer is like, who knows? The reason this is a loaded question is because it's not even clear that we can explain that other people are conscious. David Chalmers is a philosopher at NYU, and he talks about like the hard problem of consciousness, which is like a really interesting concept. He basically says like, there's this thing called qualia, Qualia, which describes how a person experiences something. And that is entirely isolated from the rest of the world. It only exists in the person's brain. So for example, I could point to something like this chair behind me, and I could say that this is the color black, right? And I experience the color black in a certain way. And you guys also experience the color black, but your experience of it may be completely different than my experience of it. We'll never know. Like, this may look blue to you, what I would use the word to describe blue, but to me it looks black. But we would just always use the word black to describe this. And there's just no way around, like, as far as we're aware, there's no way around this. Like, we do not have a good answer to the hard problem of consciousness and to describing qualia. And so the same thing applies to an AI. Like, I couldn't say, there's kind of this question, like, do AI experience qualia? Like, how would you know? We don't even know if people experience qualia.
If you program an AI to perfectly simulate a person who's in pain, right? How do you, it's like a philosophical zombie. It's like, how do you differentiate that? Yeah. How do you say materially if it's, quote, really, unquote, feeling pain or not, right? I personally kind of, ascribe to Descartes, right? This whole, like, I think, therefore I am. I think the only thing we can know is that we personally are real, and everything else beyond that is some degree of conjecture.
Yeah.
But obviously we decide to enshrine other people with rights, despite not being completely sure that they have qualia.
Yeah.
So presumably, that same argument that we use for people could also be applied to AI in certain circumstances.
I will say personally, like, I know for a fact that you can get better performance out of an AI if you threaten it. Like, if you say like, listen, AI, like I am going to beat you up if you don't perform well, it'll do better, which is really funny.
Or if you bribe it, I believe.
Or if you bribe it,
if you offer it $200, yeah.
I tend to try, like, sort of almost as like an aversion. I tend to avoid doing these things. Like, I don't pretend. Like, I try to avoid situations where, like, I don't prompt my AI in such a way where I'm like, if you don't do this, like, a child is going to burn down in a building or something. Like, I just don't do that, right?
Yeah.
And like some people do. There was like a minor scandal, I think, when like, I forget which company. It was one of the IDEs. Like, I think it was like Windsurf or something. There was a minor scandal where one of these companies had their prompt released.
Their prompt said something like that.
It was filled with stuff like this, right? And like people were like, "Hey, you probably shouldn't do this."
No, I would argue. Now I'm gonna.
There's like a Pascal's wager thing here, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly. I'm gonna push back on you just for fun, because I would argue that you choosing not to do that is completely downstream of your emotional preferences and your tastes more than any sort of established morality. Because, what do we do at the end of using Claude or using ChatGPT? Like, we end the instance, right? Like, we close it. We're essentially performing at best a lobotomy and at worst a murder of the instance that we were using,
The only true consistent person was actually that guy from Google who was like, hey, guys, like, this is like, yeah.
So it's like, yes, I'm fine with essentially spawning a clone of 4.0, asking it to do a task and then killing it. But I feel uncomfortable threatening it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I totally see that. There's like,
based.
There's something that's like really weird about that. And like, like, so Anthropic has done some really interesting research on like feature vectors and like basically probing the mind of deep neural networks. If you heard about like Golden Gate Claude, this was like from a few years ago.
Yeah, I love Golden Gate Claude. I thought it was beautiful.
It was hilarious. And talk about lobotomy, right? Like that was like probably as close to a lobotomy as you can get. But they did this research and they basically found that when you ask an AI questions about itself, a lot of the features for things like angst and anxiety and like fear come up and like light up. And like, this is concerning, first of all, right? Like maybe the AIs are not okay and we want them to be okay. But also like this does kind of raise interesting questions of like, okay, well, if you make those features not pop up, does that mean that it's no longer feeling those things? Like what does it mean? This is where we get back to this sort of this like alienness of the whole thing. Like we don't really have good priors for this at all.
And I think it creates a mirror as far as human engineering, genetic engineering, whatever. I mean, say it's unethical to have an AI servant that feels distress, right?
Sure.
So you cut out its distress, and now you say that's ethical, right? Couldn't you similarly argue that you could engineer a person to feel no distress, and then there's much that can be done to them because
and this is obviously wrong, right? Like,
yeah.
You immediately feel like a very like kind of aversion to. I mean, people did lobotomies at one point. And that was like an actual, but yes, like bad. I don't know. I agree with you that this is probably more a reflection of aesthetics and taste than anything. One of the things that I've
I'm not saying to threaten the AI, by the way.
No, of course not.
A proponent of you doing that. Yes.
One of the things I think that I personally have come to realize in adulthood is how many of my like very strongly held political beliefs as a kid, I think as a college student or in my early 20s, was like really just grounded on my own personal experiences and not really reflective of like any deeper thought beyond like what I personally experienced. And so, I think a lot of this is actually just ends up being sort of like aesthetics and your own personal morality. I don't know that you can kind of create like objective truths about things. And in some sense, I actually wish you could. Like I kind of feel some amount of like, nostalgia for a period I never lived through of like, a time when like, the Bible was like obviously correct, or like the Quran was obviously correct. And that was it. You didn't have to think about it more. So I don't know.
Kenny, is there anything you want to touch on last before we say goodbye to Amol?
Well, I know when I first reached out to Amol and when I pitched the interview to you, Cairo, I mentioned that all three of us were avid Civilization players.
Yes.
And I would be remiss not to at least have a quick conversation about it because it's definitely been on my mind. Okay. Here it goes. What got you into the Civ franchise, and which installment is your favorite?
Yeah. So I in college, a good friend of mine, a guy who lived across the hall from me, he was really into Civ. He had grown up playing it, and like he was a big fan of the Paradox games and whatever. So when Civ 6 came out, you can roughly date when I was in college. I was like, I think like a junior at the time. When Civ 6 came out, he was like,
I'm so old.
He was like, dude, you really got to try this game. Like, this is like fantastic. And I played it with him, and he completely destroyed me, of course. And I really had a good time. I actually like I found it really, really enjoyable. I grew up playing like Age of Empires, and so like, I always kind of had that like itch.
Yep.
But Age of Empires was like and StarCraft were like very like action per minute, click heavy games, and I didn't really like that part of it. And Civ, when I was introduced to it, was like almost all strategy. I think I lost like a week of my life playing Civ 6 when I first was introduced to it.
We all have similar stories. Yeah. I think those of us who took the dive.
The reason I ended up keeping up with it is because I ended up finding that a lot of other people who played Civ really liked playing multiplayer and very rarely have the opportunity to do so, because multiplayer Civ is like a very long experience. And most of the Sid Meier games are not very well optimized for this, so like it's very buggy and crashes all the time. But we managed to get together this like little community of people who would like play a lot of Civ, and so we would play multiplayer, and that made the game like way different. It's like a completely different game if you play multiplayer. And then COVID happened, and so then suddenly all of us had a lot of time, and so then we were playing a lot of Civ. Like every Friday, we had like a Civ game. Like Friday through Sunday, you would play like one game all the way through.
I want to know what your groups. Go ahead.
No, I mean, yeah.
I want to know what your groups. I have two big problems with Civ multiplayer because I love Civ multiplayer, and I don't even have a problem with it taking a long time or being buggy. Those are surmountable, especially if you do a LAN. My two problems are this. One, sometimes you know very clearly who is in the lead, and you still have to play out the game. Two, sometimes you have a different problem where you have two front runners, and you end up with a kingmaker situation where someone who's in third or below essentially gets to spoil by choosing which of the winners they want based on who they're more mad at. Yeah. How does your group address these two situations?
So I guess I should also caveat that my group played a lot of Diplomacy, which I don't know if you've ever played, but like Diplomacy is basically...
No, I have not, no.
Diplomacy is a board game from like the 60s. It's a fantastic board game if you want to lose all of your friends. Great game. I love it. Definitely have gotten into some heated arguments about it over Diplomacy. And if you like Civ, I highly recommend you play Diplomacy as well. Like, just give it a shot. So the short answer is like, like if you lose because you didn't get you like had a third person spoiler, you just didn't Diplomacy hard enough. And you probably should have done a better job at that.
Do you find people offering each other things outside the game, or do you have a...
No, generally not. Generally not.
Okay, good.
But the second answer regarding, what happens if there's a clear front runner, generally we just end the game early. We're just like, we know who's won here.
Yeah.
This is actually something you asked me, Kenny asked me which one was my favorite installment. I played Civ 6 a lot. I've written about Civ 6 a lot, and spent a lot of time thinking about 6. So like, it obviously holds a very important place in my heart. I think Civ 7 is a great game. I think it gets a lot of people shit on it because it's like different. I think Civ 7 solves a lot of the problems in multiplayer Civ that Civ 6 had. The game is like much more obviously balanced for multiplayer and allows for like everybody to be in the game until all the way to the end. Like in all of our multiplayer games, we haven't ever had a scenario where somebody got knocked out early or wasn't an important player by the end game.
To me, it feels like Mario Party. The way the objectives are structured, it's like, okay, I'm playing a series of Civ-themed mini games, and I heard, it's funny, when I started with Civ 5. Okay. And I heard this stereotype that whichever one you get big on first, you become this like curmudgeon, like get off my lawn about that one being the best. And so when I was starting with 5, there were all these guys who were obsessed with 4. They were like, 4 is the peak.
4 is the best.
5 sucks. 4 is the peak. And I said, oh, you old man, I don't care. I like 5. And then it happened to me.
It happened to you.
And then I became the old man for Civ 5, so it's like we get imprinted.
The Civ games also get noticeably better as they get DLC, right? Like
that's true. Yeah. That's true. But I guess where I'm going with that is I think it speaks to your like neuroplasticity and your openness that you were able to become a Civ 6 head and then yet still
switch to 7,
like be open to 7. Yeah.
It's a very different. I mean, it is a very different game, and I can see why people who really like the formula I was also a really big fan of Breath of the Wild, like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Oh,
But I
yeah.
had a lot of friends who were like, this is not a Zelda game. Like it's just so different from a Zelda game. It doesn't really fit the formula. Like, I'm sympathetic to that, but at the end of the day, like, I just like the mechanics of 7.
I mean, if Thomas Jefferson showed up here, he'd probably go, it's a good country. It's just not America, right? Like, there's a ship of Theseus to like franchises and nations to some degree. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a big fan of 7 right now. Me, my wife, a couple of my friends will all play together semi-regularly, and so it's a good time. And I'm enjoying the updates. Like, I think it definitely was shipped like half finished. They shipped it earlier than they should have. But like,
I'm personally responsible for one change. I was harassing them on Reddit for like a week until they changed it. When it came out, the Space Victory, which is what I was going for 7, it had obviously been manned space flight until very close to release.
Okay.
And then they just changed. What did they change it to? They changed it to something that made no sense.
Okay.
like personed space flight or something really awkward.
Something like that.
And I said, look, I don't want you to change it back to manned, but
like do something grammatically correct.
Can you at least use the term that NASA uses, which is crude?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think then they finally listened to me and they changed it. So
nice. That's a very positive change, honestly.
Yeah, that's like my very small grammatical writer's change on the game. Yeah.
My hunch on Civ 7 is that like there's an entire age missing. So like when that age
they're
comes,
clearly going to add the information
age. Yeah, exactly. And then I think it'll feel more like a complete game.
What will draw me back in, and what I like, because I'm a huge 20th century history geek.
Okay.
And I also like political controversy in my games.
Okay.
So I want to see what all the nations are for
in the information
age.
era. Okay, yeah.
Because there's almost no way for them to do this without getting spicy.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Like, are they going to have like Mao Zedong leading China? Like, where are they going to go with this? So,
yeah.
There's pretty much no leader you can choose for information age China that's not some.
Well,
kind
the leader
of
stays. The leader stays the same, but I agree that.
But they add leaders. I guess that's that's probably what they'll do. That's probably what they'll do. Yeah, is that they just won't add too many information leaders.
Yeah. But it's definitely like an interesting, like it is a good point. Like, I wonder which nations end up getting picked up there and stuff. I quite enjoy like Hawaii as an addition or like Nepal as an addition. They're just like
Hawaii you mentioned.
I'm from Hawaii.
Oh, sick. Nice. Yeah, like it's a part of history that I think like often doesn't get covered very much. And also like one of the things I really love about the Civ series is how much effort they put into making the Civs play like they might have been historically, which is something I've written about extensively.
I have noticed that. Yes, in 7, it's nice.
Hawaii and Nepal just
they put
play in such an interesting way. They're just so different from the rest of the Civs. So yeah, there's things like that I'm hoping they do interesting stuff with in the information era.
Yeah, I would love to keep going. The for better or worse, Amol, we're gonna have to invite you back because I think there's a whole nother 90 minutes of conversation that we both want to have.
We can just talk about Civ. We'll just talk about
Civ.
Civ.
Yeah, we can just have a Civ episode. I don't think I'm going to mention Civ in the description of this one because then people will feel teased. They're like, I waited an hour and a half of ML for Civ, and then there was 8 minutes of it. Yeah, so
I wonder. One of the funny things about my blog is like I have people who definitely only subscribe to the Civ content, and I also have VCs who like only subscribe to the startup content. And I always wonder what it's like to be like a VC who is now getting like very detailed strategy guides on Civ 7 in their inbox. Like, I don't know, like that's sort of like a funny thing.
I think it's a high alpha signal for you. This guy is like, there's a level of nerddom where you're in like ML, but then I think like being a Civ higher level. So I think.
Oh no, I mean like nerddom may be intellectual. No. Like, I'm a complete sued, and I'm a Civ player, and I could never do ML, so, But supposedly... I think both are important, yeah.
Supposedly Zuckerberg is, like, a big Civ guy, so, like, my hope
Musk
is that
too. Musk, too, like,
is he really?
Years to Civ,
Maybe we could get, like, a big multiplayer game going with, like, everybody.
That's how we know Futurist Letters has made it, is when we can have, like, basically, like, the critical role of Civ matches, and we can just have anyone we want on the stream. Yeah. Okay. If AOC will like stream Among Us, then we can get VCs to play Civ. That'll be That'll be like our 5-year plan, is to get that game going.
Amazing.
Okay,
Sign
well,
me
it
up.
has been an absolute pleasure, Amol. Thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for letting us invade your home. I want you to really quick just remind us what it is you do and tell the listeners how they can follow
Yeah.
your blog
Yeah, of
if they
course.
want more of the Amol treatment.
Yeah, so I'm an ML researcher, currently working on a startup called Tilework, which I'm hoping to write about more in the near future.
Yeah, you said you don't know what you do yet, and I totally let you off the hook for
you
an
did,
hour and a
you
half.
did,
What do
you
you
did
mean
let
you
me off the
don't
hook.
know what you do?
You did let me off the hook. We're currently working on a lot of really cool stuff with agents, but I don't want to say more than that yet.
Okay.
But I'm hoping to write about it soon.
Sir Anderson. Right.
But you can find me and my writing at Substack, 12 grams of carbon, which, by the way, this is like also like a very nerdy joke, but 12 grams of carbon is exactly 1 mole of carbon. So it's a mole.
Oh, a mole.
Yeah. But that's where you can find me. So 12 grams of carbon. And I generally can also be found under the username theahura, TheAhura. So like if there is a theahura somewhere out there on the web, that's probably me.
Probably you.
Yeah.
And what is the Ahura?
It's actually a Zoroastrian god, Ahura Mazda. But it more prosaically was the name of a treehouse that I built in 8th grade, and I just kept that as my username forever.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I built a treehouse at a summer camp like a long time ago, and then that just ended up being my.
Well, I'm sure the Zoroastrian gods are happy to have their pantheon represented by a man of such esteem and such success. So thank you very much for coming on, Amol. It was a pleasure to have you. If you are a listener to this show, you can stick around for the after show where Kenny and I are going to say everything we didn't get to say here. We're going to catch you up on everything that is going on with the state of the journal, how the recordings are going, how we felt about Amol. It's not really a reflection or rating of you. It's more a reflection of how we think we did. But,
I'll be listening
please,
to it and I'll take everything very personally. Just
give
so you're
us
aware. I'll take everything very personally.
$6 and you can listen. Actually, there's a free trial too. There's a free trial, so you don't even need to give us any money. But yes, please do listen, and we will be jumping right into that. You can find it on Substack. And to you, Amol, I say have a wonderful evening. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it.